Have you ever been in a place so famous, so busy, and suddenly something inexplicable happened? That strange feeling of being watched, as if something or someone was there but you couldn't see it. That's exactly what happened to me in the famous Times Square, in the heart of New York. I'd always dreamed of being there in those moments of pure energy, surrounded by sparkling lights and the hustle and bustle of people from all over the world. Times Square, the symbol of everything iconic about the city. When I finally arrived, it felt like the magic of New York was all around me, just as I'd always imagined. The bright lights, the giant screens with colorful advertisements, and the typical sounds of a metropolis that never sleeps. But slowly, something began to change, and what should have been an unforgettable experience turned into an uncomfortable sensation, something I couldn't explain. As if the city had stopped being the vibrant place it was and had become something else. Have you ever felt like, as you stepped away from the crowd, the place around you began to feel different, emptier, darker? It was as if the glow of the Times Square lights began to fade, and a strange stillness fell over the streets. People passed by me, but I felt as if I were being watched, as if something or someone was there, but no one else seemed to notice. I knew something was wrong, but I couldn't put my finger on it. I continued on my way, trying to ignore the feeling of unease. It will pass, I thought, but the worst was yet to come. I began to notice shadowy figures reflected in the windows of the buildings. At first glance, I thought it was a trick of the light, something illusory. But when I looked again, the figures were even clearer. Figures that didn't move, that didn't belong there, as if they were trapped there, watching. My body shivered, my heart raced. Something wasn't right, but doubt consumed me. I wanted to leave, but the feeling of being watched followed me. Have you ever experienced this? Did you feel like you were being watched, but when you looked around, there was no one there? Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to tell you now may surprise you. When I finally decided to check my phone's security cameras, something even more disturbing happened. The ghostly figure's reflection was there, behind me. But when I asked the people around me, no one else seemed to see anything. They were oblivious, as if I were just imagining it. The feeling of being trapped in an illusion intensified with each passing second. But the scariest thing of all was what happened next. I couldn't get back to the hotel. The route I knew by heart no longer existed. The streets were different. I was lost, and Times Square didn't look the same. It felt like time and space were distorting, and I couldn't escape. Stay with me. What I discovered that night is something that can shake your perception of reality, and with every step I took, the feeling of being watched, of being trapped in something beyond what simple reality could explain, grew. Do you believe the world around you can change? I've come to believe it can. And you, what would you do if you were in my position? What I discovered that night in Times Square, you'll find out now. But before I continue, do you really think you're alone in your city? As I tried to understand what was happening, the streets around me seemed to transform, as if the city itself had become a prison without doors. Every corner I turned, every attempt to return to the familiar path took me deeper into a distorted reality. I was lost, not just physically, but in a space where time seemed to drag and distort, as if the very fabric of the city were being ripped apart. I still felt the invisible eyes watching me, and the feeling of being followed intensified with every step. The strangest thing of all was that when I looked at others, no one seemed to notice what was happening. People went about their lives, oblivious to what was happening around me. This only made it all the more frightening. But even in the face of all this terror, something told me I wasn't alone in this experience. That feeling of being watched. Perhaps you've felt it at some point. Perhaps you've experienced the discomfort of being in a familiar place and suddenly feeling the reality around you shift without explanation. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever experienced something like this? A place that seemed normal suddenly turned into something strange, even macabre. Leave a comment below and share your experience. or even what you think about what happened to me that night. Your opinion is very important to me, and I'd love to hear how you would react in a situation like this. And if you're enjoying this content, if this kind of story intrigues and engages you, don't forget to like the video. This helps me a lot to continue bringing more mysteries like this to the channel. And, of course, if you want to keep following more stories like this, subscribe to the channel. Your subscription is what allows me to continue creating more content, and together we can explore many other mysteries that you may not have discovered yet. Your participation is what makes this channel grow, reach more people, and perhaps bring more answers to the mysteries that surround us. I'm very grateful that you're here, and I believe that together we can unravel many other enigmas of our reality, or what it may hide. But before we continue, tell me, do you think this is all a coincidence? Or is there something much deeper going on in Times Square than meets the eye? Let's continue this journey. It was an ordinary night in Times Square, or at least it seemed so. The bright city lights, the massive billboards, the 24-hour shops, and the vibrant energy of New York were there, as always. But as I walked away from the hustle and bustle, I realized something wasn't right. The streets, normally bustling with tourists, cars, and pedestrians, were now eerily empty. What had been a tide of people had become a kind of void. A disconcerting stillness took over, something that didn't fit with my image of Times Square. That feeling of emptiness wasn't just physical, it seemed to permeate the entire atmosphere. There were no cars honking, no sounds of those side conversations you hear at any time on the street. I could only hear my own footsteps echoing, and that's when I realized there was something in the air, something almost palpable. A heavy silence. It wasn't the kind of silence you'd find in any big city at night. It was a silence of expectancy, as if the world were holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. And that something didn't feel good. I don't know if it was an instinctive feeling, one of those that arise when you're in a familiar place, but something told me that night would be different. The kind of feeling you can't explain, but that suddenly begins to make perfect sense as events unfold. Something was watching me, something I couldn't see but felt intensely. Somehow I knew I wasn't alone on that empty street, even though there was no one else around me. What made me even more uneasy was the way the city lights seemed to transform. In the blink of an eye, the vibrant Times Square with its glowing screens seemed to be fading. The lights began to dim, and I could have sworn the buildings around me were changing, as if the environment itself was ceasing to be what I knew and transforming into something different, something darker. It was as if the city was slowly disintegrating, and I was a mere spectator to this change. It was when I glanced at the windows of one of the buildings next to me that the feeling of unease intensified. At first glance, it seemed like an illusion, perhaps a reflection in the window caused by the dim streetlight. But when I looked again, I realized something was moving there, behind the glass. A figure, or at least a shadow, that seemed to exist only in that empty space between the panes. I tried to ignore it, thinking it was my mind playing tricks on me. However, I couldn't. I looked again, and there it was. A figure. Faceless, but with a movement that shouldn't be there. I stood frozen for a moment. My heart raced. My first thought was that perhaps I was tired, that my mind was playing tricks on me, but that reflection was too clear to ignore. The figure behind the glass seemed to be watching, as if it knew I was watching. But when I tried to move closer to investigate, it disappeared. It wasn't a natural transition. There was no smooth movement. It simply vanished, as if it had never been there. The feeling of terror that washed over me was instantaneous, and doubt began to creep into my mind. What was it? A trick of the light? Or was there something else going on that night? I walked away quickly, trying to rationalize what I'd seen, trying to convince myself it was just an illusion. After all, in a city like New York where anything is possible, perhaps it wasn't so strange. But as I walked through the deserted streets, the feeling of being watched only grew. It was as if that reflection, that figure, had left a mark on me, as if I were now part of something beyond my comprehension, something that was following me, watching me. With each step I took, the streets seemed darker and quieter, and the feeling of being watched grew more intense. I wanted to believe it was just my imagination, that the city lights were creating shadows that played with my perception. But something inside me knew otherwise. Something was there that night, in the shadows of Times Square. Something unseen, but something I could feel, like an invisible presence moving around me. I knew I couldn't go on like this, not understanding what was happening. But as I looked around, I realized the paths were changing. The streets I knew by heart, the same ones I'd walked so many times, were different. The buildings, the shops, everything was altered. I was lost, and Times Square, which had always been a symbol of life and energy, now seemed like a labyrinth, a silent prison. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this topic because the hidden truth that was unfolding before me was far more terrifying than I could have imagined. I wasn't just lost on the streets of New York. I was lost in a distorted reality where the visible and the invisible began to blur in ways I never could have anticipated. And worst of all, I didn't know where this journey would take me. That figure appearing out of nowhere in the glass left me completely paralyzed. For a moment, I wasn't sure if it was real or just a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. It was as if the very space around me had momentarily distorted and the shadow had materialized straight from a nightmare. When I turned quickly, trying to face whatever it was, I felt something moving away from me, like a presence disappearing as quickly as it had appeared. The glass reflected a reality different from the one I knew, and I no longer knew where my perception began and where it ended. Times Square, with all its brilliance and energy, was being taken over by a darkness that seemed to swallow my reason. I stood there, motionless, for what seemed like an eternity, my mind struggling to comprehend what I had just seen. My breathing was rapid, the sound of my heartbeat echoing in my head. But when I looked around again, I realized there was no one else there. The few pedestrians who passed by were like fleeting shadows, faceless, soundless. The world was unraveling before my eyes, and a chilling sense of loneliness and despair began to consume me. I could no longer trust what I saw, because the rules of reality seemed to be shifting invisibly, as if something were preparing to reveal something much greater, something I wasn't yet ready to understand. The shadow I saw in that glass wasn't a simple illusion. I knew this because, more than an image, it carried a feeling. The feeling that someone or something was there, watching me, waiting. I could no longer escape this perception. The reflections in the glass weren't just reflections. They were like windows to another world. A world where the rules of physics, time, and logic no longer applied. Each time I looked at the glass, the feeling grew stronger. This was no ordinary reflection. Something was communicating with me, but not in the conventional way. I didn't know what it was, nor why I was being drawn into this strange and threatening game, but I felt myself being drawn, like a magnet pulling a tool, helpless to resist. I tried to rationalize, searching for logical explanations. Maybe it was just fatigue, maybe the city lights, the reflection of the signs and giant screens playing tricks on my eyes. But deep down, something told me it wasn't that. And no matter how much I tried to deny it, something inside me knew the feeling of being watched wasn't a coincidence. Every movement of the shadows, every shift in the light, seemed part of a larger plan. Something was watching me in that city that never sleeps. Something beyond human comprehension. Something that couldn't be explained by logic. The feeling of being watched grew. I knew there was something more to this place, something unseen but ever present, as if the very space around me was more than just concrete and glass. It was as if Times Square, this nerve center of the city, was hiding something much deeper, something not visible at first glance, but revealed itself between the lines. The figure that appeared in the glass was perhaps just the first clue to a reality beyond what I knew. Worst of all, as I tried to convince myself I was just imagining it, the feeling of being watched wouldn't go away. On the contrary, it intensified with every step I took. I felt watched from all sides, and even when I glanced at others, no one seemed to notice anything strange. They walked past me, oblivious to what was happening, as if I were the only one who understood. It was as if I were in a horror movie, where the only person aware of the danger was the viewer, and everyone else was oblivious, living a reality that was nothing more than a facade. The most disturbing thing was when I began to see more shadows, more figures moving in the windows of the buildings. They weren't people, they weren't reflections. They were something different. A presence, a ghostly presence moving between the lines, between the lights and shadows of the city. What was that? It wasn't a traditional ghost, like the stories we hear about. No, this was more. Something with an intention. Something I knew about myself, about everyone there. As if the city itself had a life that wasn't visible, but was seeping into the streets, the buildings, the people. I wanted to get out of there. I wanted to return to the hotel, where everything seemed safe and familiar. But when I looked around, the path I had taken no longer existed. The streets were distorted. Times Square was no longer the same. Every step I took seemed to take me further away from a reality I understood, and closer to an unknown, frightening place. I knew I could no longer go back, not now, because what I'm about to share will reveal a hidden truth about that place. Something much darker, something many of you may never have imagined, if you're wondering what was really happening that night. What's behind it all? The answer is more complex and terrifying than any of us could have anticipated. And I'm about to reveal everything I've discovered, because the history of Times Square is far from just an urban legend. The discomfort I was feeling didn't lessen. On the contrary, it grew with every second I spent on those empty, desolate streets. I tried to rationalize, to understand what was happening. It's just fatigue, I thought. Maybe my mind is playing tricks. On me, the stress of being away from home. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the more intense they became. Something was wrong, I knew it with all my might. That feeling of being watched, that inexplicable shadow, the lights going out. It was all beyond my comprehension. Anxiety began to mix with fear. I was no longer in Times Square, that bustling, vibrant place. No, I was somewhere else, in a space that didn't fit with what I knew. Something was happening to me, something that couldn't be explained by any logic I knew. There were no more familiar streets, no more familiar sounds. The city was transforming into something darker. I needed answers, and fast. That's when the idea of checking the security cameras came to me. I remembered seeing one in a nearby building and decided to check it on my phone, perhaps hoping that what I was feeling was just paranoia. When the security camera app loaded, what I saw stopped me cold. On the screen, right behind me, was the figure, the same ghostly figure I'd seen in the reflection of the windows. It was there, sharp and clear, still. There was no doubt. The presence that had been watching me, that I felt so intensely, was now visible to me through the camera. What shocked me most was the fact that no one else around me noticed. I looked at the people nearby. They walked as if nothing was happening. I saw nothing on their faces that suggested anything was wrong. It was as if I were the only one who saw that figure. The only person who knew there was something in those streets. Something that wasn't human, something that didn't belong there. It was as if I were the only one able to see what was really happening, and that made me feel even more helpless. I was alone, and for the first time, I felt like I was trapped in a nightmare from which I couldn't wake. The feeling of being watched intensified. It was no longer just a reflection in the windows or a distant glow on the cameras. It was a real presence. Something approaching, something feeding on my fear. With every step I took, it grew closer. I knew it wasn't just a matter of perception. I knew something was happening, something that could no longer be ignored. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. But there was no turning back. There was no denying what I was seeing, what I was feeling. Something was trying to communicate with me, or maybe just watching me, following me. I no longer knew if I was being chased by a ghost, an entity, or if it was all a construct of my tired mind. The point is, whatever it was real, and it was happening right there, on those deserted streets of Times Square. Most disturbing of all, however, was what happened next. When I tried to step forward, the figure vanished. It didn't disappear from the camera, but the feeling that washed over me was even more distressing. It was there, but no longer visible. I knew it was still watching me, still nearby, but I couldn't see it. I turned to look, around again, but the streets were even more desolate, quieter than before. And in that moment I realized I no longer had control over the situation. I was lost in a place I no longer knew. The streets of Times Square, with their vibrant lights and constant movement, were now shrouded in a dense fog, as if an invisible curtain had fallen between me and the rest of the city. Reality was becoming increasingly fluid, more distorted. I no longer knew where I was, but I knew that presence, that figure, was not something I could simply ignore. It was there, waiting for me, and I knew it wouldn't be easy to get away. The truth about what really happened that night is far from simple. It wasn't just a ghost. It wasn't just a shadow. What I was facing there, what was happening in Times Square, had a much older, much deeper origin. And the answers were much closer than I could have imagined. Something was slowly being revealed, and I, as a witness, was about to discover its impact on my life and what I knew about the world around me. The transformation was beginning, and it was no longer a matter of me being a victim of a supernatural phenomenon. No, I was beginning to realize I was involved in something much bigger, something that transcended mere notions of fear and mystery, something that was about to change my perspective on everything. I knew I needed to get back to the hotel, but as I walked away from the hustle and bustle of Times Square, what I encountered on the way back made me question reality itself. The streets I knew so well began to transform before my eyes, as if an invisible layer were covering the city and transporting me to a different place. I had walked these same paths before, countless times, and I knew exactly where the shops, the buildings, even the streets and sidewalks that guided me to my destination were. But that night, nothing made sense anymore. The streets began to look different, darker, more deserted, as if a veil had fallen over. And then, I passed landmarks I should have recognized immediately but didn't. The light that once illuminated the sidewalks now seemed dimmer, more distant, as if being absorbed by an invisible shadow that took over everything. I was walking, but I wasn't going anywhere. The path back, which had once seemed obvious and safe, was now a maze with no beginning or end. I was lost, but not in the conventional sense of the word. I wasn't in a place where I didn't know my way around. I was lost in time and space, in a place that was no longer part of the world I knew. It was as if Times Square itself was distorting, as if the place I was in had never truly existed. The buildings, everything seemed different. It wasn't just details. I was no longer seeing the same things I'd seen hours before. It was as if the space was being altered before my eyes, as if reality were being slowly rewritten beyond my control. I tried to move forward, but with every corner I turned, the streets transformed. I no longer knew if I was moving forward or backward, if I was walking in circles, or if the city had truly changed completely. It was a disconcerting sensation, as if something were pulling me away from what I knew, pushing me into a parallel reality. And the feeling of being watched, of being observed, didn't disappear. It grew even stronger. Something was following me, but it wasn't a person. It wasn't someone's footsteps on the deserted streets. It wasn't the eyes of an ordinary passerby. It was an invisible presence, an energy permeating the air, something watching my every movement, my every breath. I felt as if I were being pulled into this distortion, into this place where the rules of physics, time, and logic no longer applied, When I finally arrived at what I believed to be my hotel, the sense of relief was momentary. I was physically there, but the city around me was still different. It didn't feel real. The hotel door was locked, but I knew I'd left. It unlocked when I left earlier, yet when I tried to enter, the hotel was empty, as if no one else was there. The lights were off and the reception was silent. I felt as if time was suspended, as if the city were in some kind of pause I couldn't control. And even with the lights off and the shadows taking over the place, the feeling of being watched grew stronger. Suddenly, the hotel, which I'd always known to be safe, became another labyrinth. I no longer knew what was happening or what was real. That feeling of displacement, of no longer knowing what was part of reality and what wasn't, consumed me completely. And most terrifying of all, I knew something was happening in Times Square, something much bigger and deeper than I could comprehend. What was it? What was stalking me? And, most disturbing of all, was the ghost of Times Square still there, watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself completely. Something was telling me the answer to that question was closer than I imagined. Because what happened that night isn't just a haunting story. It's not just about a spectral figure or a shadow in the streets. No, it's much more than that. There's something more sinister, something that transcends simple explanations of ghosts and apparitions. What's really behind it all? What's lurking in Times Square, and why was I chosen to experience it? These answers could change everything we know about the world around us. With what happened to me, the sense of reality, distortion, and the touch of the unknown, something inside me began to realize that the city wasn't just a physical place. No, it was more. It was alive, in a way I never imagined. And what scares me most is that maybe I'm not the only one who's experienced this. Maybe this hidden reality has infiltrated more people's lives, and now I need to understand how far it can go. Now, the question remains. Have you ever felt anything like this? Have you ever been to a place that didn't seem real? Or have you ever had that strange feeling that something is always watching, even when you can't see it? Comment below. I'm on that journey too. Let's keep exploring, because the hidden truth of Times Square and other places like it is something that needs to be revealed. Have you ever stopped to think that in certain places, silence can be more frightening than any scream? I'd always heard stories of abandoned places, how they hold mysteries that defy logic and reason, but I never imagined I'd experience something so terrifying in such an iconic location. I was drawn to the history of the old Broadway theater, closed after a series of mysterious deaths, and, as you can imagine, curiosity overcame fear. I decided to investigate for myself. Who wouldn't want to? Explore the backstage of a place with such a dark and enigmatic history, right? But what I found that night, well, it changed everything. I always thought these mysteries were just urban legends, stories told by adrenaline seekers. But as I walked through those rusty doors, I realized the theater wasn't as abandoned as it seemed. It was as if the place itself was waiting for someone to discover its secrets. The theater's history was far from just a tragedy played out on stage. With every step, with every strange sound echoing through the walls, something told me I wasn't alone there. And it wasn't my imagination. I can't explain what I felt in words, but if you've ever been in a place that seemed to have an energy of its own, you know exactly what I'm talking about. I was ready to face whatever it was, but I never imagined that the theater, with all its grandeur and history, would hide such profound terror. Have you ever heard of theaters that come alive after years of abandonment? Well, I didn't believe it until I was there, hearing whispers coming from empty seats, footsteps that belonged to no one, and the feeling that something was watching me, guiding me through corridors that seemed endless. But the strangest thing is that, as I began to investigate further, I began to sense something different. It wasn't just noises or shadows. I knew something or someone was there, waiting, watching. And when I finally entered the rehearsal room, something pulled me into the darkness. I saw a shadow moving quickly, as if it were part of a movie scene. But when I looked in the mirror, I saw something that shouldn't be there. Someone who shouldn't be there. It wasn't possible, but it was there, reflected right behind me, like a presence from beyond. The room was cold, and the sound I'd heard, the whispers, were now clearer, more intense. I tried to leave, but I couldn't. The theater was alive, and as much as I wanted to ignore it, it was becoming more real by the minute. Have you ever experienced something like this? Have you ever felt like you were in a place where reality begins to distort, where the feeling that you're no longer in control is uncontrollable? Stay with me until the end, because what I'm about to share with you will surprise you, will make you question whether theaters really are abandoned, or if they're just waiting for the right moment to reveal their secrets. I know what happened in that Broadway theater, and what I discovered goes far beyond what any ghost story can tell. I arrived at the theater late at night, and as I approached, New York City seemed more distant, as if an invisible layer had been placed between me and the rest of the world. The sound of traffic, the hustle and bustle of the busy streets, everything was muted, as if this imposing old building were isolated from everything around it. The theater, which had once staged Broadway's grandest productions, was now empty, its curtains drawn, the seats covered in the dust of abandonment. The only light illuminating the way was the flashlight I carried, its beam flickering on the walls and broken floor. As I entered, a strange sensation washed over me. It wasn't just darkness, it was something deeper, something unseen but there, in the air. The theater was still. It was out of time, as if the clock had stopped there. It was as if the history of theater, with its great productions and artists who had graced that stage, had been swallowed by silence. What remained was a dense void, a place no longer a stage for art and life, but a sanctuary of mystery and perhaps something darker. The feeling that time stood still there was oppressive. I found myself walking through the corridors and dressing rooms, feeling the weight of each step. It was an almost palpable stillness, an unnatural tranquility, and the more I explored, the more the feeling of unease grew. The environment seemed to swallow me, pulling me into a place where logic and reasoning no longer made sense. I knew the theater had a history marked by mysterious deaths, but what I felt, there wasn't just the legacy of a forgotten place. It was as if the theater itself was waiting for me to discover it, for me to be the next to unlock the secrets buried behind the scenes. It was then that the sounds began. First, a crack, as if something were breaking in the distance. Then, footsteps that didn't belong to me. The sound echoed off the empty walls, as if someone were walking beside me, but when I looked around, no one was there. I tried to ignore it, frustrated attempts to convince myself it was just the sound of the old building, the wind rattling the broken windows, the creaking of the old wood. But the feeling of being followed wouldn't leave me. The shadows began to move strangely, as if they had taken on a life of their own, dancing on the walls, stretching and shrinking as I moved. Something seemed to be following me, something I couldn't see but felt in every corner of the theater. I found myself frozen in one spot in the room, sensing a presence that was there but I couldn't touch. The shadows seemed to huddle in a corner, as if watching my every move. My body was tense, my muscles contracted, and I knew I couldn't leave. I had to keep going, but the theater wasn't just waiting for me anymore. It was challenging me to discover what lurked within its depths. And with every step I took, with every turn I made through the corridors, the feeling that the theater was more than a physical place, that it was alive, grew stronger. I began to wonder if there was something more, something beyond what my mind wanted to admit. Was I being driven by some invisible force, as if the theater itself had a mind, a will of its own, wanting to show me something? What were those sounds? Were they merely echoes of the past, or was something more real, something more terrifying waiting to be revealed? The feeling of being watched, of being part of something greater than I could comprehend, wouldn't leave me. Every step I took, every new shadow I saw, told me I was no longer alone. I was at the heart of the mystery. And then the strangest thing happened. I was standing center stage, trying to take it all in, when a stronger shadow formed in the corner of the room. I tried looking in every direction, but it was there, in my peripheral vision. When I turned to face it directly, the shadow disappeared, but the feeling of being watched intensified. The theater was alive, and somehow it knew me. It was testing me. Now, I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because what I encountered that night, in that seemingly abandoned theater, wasn't just a reflection of a dark past. It wasn't just about the mysterious deaths or the rumors. There was something more, something I hadn't yet fully grasped, something waiting to be discovered, something that could only be revealed along my journey. And you, what do you think lies behind this story? Is the theater truly alive, or is there something darker, something beyond what meets the eye? I decided to delve deeper, my curiosity drawing me back to the heart of the theater. When I entered the rehearsal room, absolute silence enveloped me, broken only by my own footsteps echoing off the empty walls. The air was thick, and a sense of eeriness seemed to envelop me even more. The room, which should have been a preparation space where actors rehearse their roles and the stage comes to life, was now desolate, filled with an unusual and oppressive stillness. Every corner, every inch of the place seemed to hold a story, but the seemingly silent walls held more than simple memories. It was then that something began to change. The sound, something I'd initially assumed was the wind blowing against the broken windows, began to transform. It was no longer the distant murmur of the city. It was whispers, subtle and almost imperceptible, as if someone was speaking very softly, as if the words were trying to escape something or perhaps someone. I froze for a moment. My heart pounded. This is impossible, I thought. It can't be real. But the whispers continued, coming from all sides, infiltrating every corner of that room, invading my thoughts almost like a presence. I stopped in the middle of the room, trying to listen more clearly. The sound was slowly intensifying, becoming clearer. It wasn't the wind. It wasn't the sound of the theater's ancient structures. It was voices, voices that seemed charged with urgency, with something that didn't want to be ignored. I looked around, but there was no one there. The room was empty as my mind at that moment as I tried to understand what was happening. But there was no denying it anymore. Something was there, something from the past, something unseen but becoming increasingly evident as the whispers intensified. The atmosphere of the theater was shifting again, as if the place itself were reconfiguring itself before me. I found myself paralyzed, unable to move a single muscle. The voices wouldn't stop. They seemed to envelop me, pulling me into a dimension I didn't understand. They weren't clear words, but fragments of lost stories, voices of people no longer among us, but who, in that moment, seemed to insist on being heard, on revealing themselves. It was as if I were listening to a piece of the theater's soul, a soul that had never been erased. Trapped there, somewhere between the curtains and the wings, waiting to be discovered, the feeling of being watched grew even stronger. I was no longer alone. The shadows, which had previously seemed like a trick of the light, now took on a life of their own. They moved, stretching across the walls, as if they too were trying to hear what the voices were saying. It was as if the theater itself was beginning to manifest, as if it had become aware of its own existence. I could no longer tell what was real and what wasn't. The voices continued to echo, now closer, clearer, as if they were trying to guide me to something I didn't want to find, something that somehow was already waiting for me. I tried to ignore it, tried to convince myself it was all just an illusion caused by the solitude of that place. But I couldn't deny it anymore. The voices were more present, clearer, as if the theater had become a kind of portal to a buried past. A past that hadn't been completely erased. The feeling that something was there, watching my every move, became unbearable. I knew something or someone was guiding me, leading me to a discovery I wasn't ready for. I knew I could no longer ignore it. Something was begging to be discovered, to be revealed, and I had no choice but to move forward. Whatever it was, the voices from the past were now in tune with the theater, as if it were pulsing, alive, in a way I'd never imagined. I began to move again, the sound of the voices following me, dragging me into a dark corridor. The theater, which had previously seemed merely an abandoned building, now seemed to have an energy of its own, as if it were more than just a physical place. It was becoming an extension of something larger, something unseen but felt, like a presence that accompanied me with every step. Because what I began to realize there, in that moment, wasn't just about the voices of the past, no. The theater held something much darker, something I couldn't fully comprehend. It was there, right in front of me, waiting to be unearthed. And I knew that to discover what was really happening, I would have to face the theater itself, confront the shadows it was trying to show me, and perhaps also confront what I wasn't ready to see. And you, what would you do if you were in my shoes? The air grew thicker as I walked toward the stage. Each step seemed to resonate louder, as if the theater itself were watching me, testing me. A strange sensation washed over me. I knew I should stop, that I should turn and leave, but an invisible force pulled me forward, as if the theater itself were calling me. Shadows danced on the walls, and I felt something was about to happen, something I couldn't control. When I finally reached the stage, the old curtain was half open, almost as if it had been waiting for me. I peered into the darkness behind the curtain, trying to see beyond the gloom, but what I saw paralyzed me. Something was moving quickly, so quickly I could barely make out what it was. It wasn't a person, not a concrete figure. It was a shadow, a fluid, uncontrollable movement, as if it were alive. I knew I shouldn't be there. Every cell in my body told me to turn and run, to get out of that place as quickly as possible. But something inside me stopped me. I couldn't stop looking. Something held me there, something I couldn't see but felt with growing intensity. When I turned, the reflection in the mirror froze me. It wasn't my reflection. It was someone else, a figure I didn't recognize, someone who shouldn't have been there. But they were, and they seemed to be watching me as intensely as I was watching them. It was as if this shadow, this presence, was part of my reflection, part of my very existence in that space. What did it mean? What was happening to me? Was I seeing things, or was the theater really showing me something I couldn't comprehend? I was trapped. There was no escaping that feeling. The fear, which had only just begun to creep in before, now completely overwhelmed me. The theater somehow held me there. It was as if it had a life of its own, as if it were slowly consuming me, making me part of its story, its tragedy. I didn't know if it was the place or something deeper, something supernatural, but what I felt there was undeniable. Something was taking over me, my body, my mind. The figure in the mirror seemed to beckon me, as if it wanted me to come closer, to follow it, but I knew I shouldn't. I knew it wasn't safe. The shadow, the presence I felt in every corner of that theater, wasn't something I should toy with. But fear kept me from thinking clearly. What I wanted was to leave, to run away from that place, but the mirror seemed to hypnotize me. The figure reflected behind me was as real as I was, as alive as I was. I didn't know what I wanted, but I knew I couldn't ignore it. The walls of the theater began to close in on me. Each movement of the shadow in the mirror seemed to move with an unsettling fluidity, as if the darkness itself were growing denser and denser with each passing second. The reflection in the mirror began to distort, and I realized that somehow I was losing control. I was no longer just a spectator. I was being drawn into the center of the story, into the heart of that mystery. I was being swallowed by the presence the theater had held for so long, and I could no longer tell where the theater ended and where I began. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body wouldn't respond. I was paralyzed, my eyes fixed on the mirror, What I saw there wasn't real, couldn't be real, but at the same time it was as real as the fear that consumed me. I no longer knew what was happening, whether it was a nightmare, a hallucination, or if somehow I was being consumed by something much larger, something that lurked behind those ancient walls. What happened to me in that rehearsal room wasn't just about shadows and distorted reflections. No, the theater was showing me something I didn't want to see, but something I needed to understand. Something that was right in front of me, something that had been buried in the theater's foundations for years. And as the mysteries began to reveal themselves, I knew there was something much darker waiting to be uncovered, something that should never have been left behind, something that now was coming to the surface, ready to show me the hidden truth of theater. The air was thick with palpable tension. The feeling that something was watching me hadn't diminished. On the contrary, it intensified with every passing second inside that theater. The sound of my own footsteps echoed in the emptiness, but it seemed muffled, as if the space itself were absorbing any noise, any attempt at resistance. It was as if the place were absorbing me, making me part of its history, becoming just another of the invisible presences that haunted those walls, and I was trapped there, unable to escape. I approached the door, desperately trying to get out, but when I put my hand on the handle, something strange happened. The door wouldn't open. I tried again, harder, but the handle wouldn't budge. It was as if something were blocking the exit. It wasn't a simple locking mechanism anymore. It wasn't the kind of resistance you'd expect from an ordinary door. Something much more sinister was there, something I couldn't comprehend. It was as if the theater itself had closed its doors on me, as if it were preventing me from leaving. I took a few steps back, my heart pounding, and looked around. The theater was so quiet, so empty, yet so full of presence. I knew I wasn't alone. Whatever I felt was real. The feeling of being watched grew even stronger. It was as if the theater was aware of my presence, as if it had a will of its own, something beyond being just an abandoned place. It was alive. I felt it with every fiber of my being, the feeling of being controlled, of being trapped in a place that somehow possessed me. Made me think of everything I'd heard about the theater, the legends, the stories about spirits that refused to leave, about something sinister lurking in the shadows. But this was much more than mere fantasy. I knew it. The theater was testing me, forcing me to understand something I wasn't ready to comprehend. It wasn't just observing, it was deciding my fate. And that's when the truth became clear. The theater was no ordinary place. It wasn't simply holding the memories of its past productions or the echoes of laughter and applause. The theater was the very keeper of secrets, the very battlefield where souls, stories, and tragedies intermingled. I was being drawn into this space, not as a witness, but as a part of it. I was now a piece on this grand chessboard the theater was setting, and the pieces were being moved in ways I didn't understand. But what frightened me most was realizing there was no way back. The theater, with its dark walls and heavy silence, had become a labyrinth. Each corridor seemed to lead me deeper, closer to what it wanted to show me. But I knew I could no longer ignore the truth. The theater was alive. And somehow it was determined to keep me there forever, as part of its history, as one of the figures that would never leave. Now, every time I think about that night, I wonder, is the theater still waiting for me? Is it alive, waiting for others like me to come to it, to share in its mysteries and untold stories? Or is there something deeper, something even more dangerous, something just waiting for the right moment to reveal itself? The theater, that place I had seen only as a performance stage, revealed itself as a breathing, feeling, unpredictable being. And somehow, I knew that whatever was there, lurking in the shadows and whispers, wasn't finished with me. The theater was just beginning to show me who or what it truly was. Because what I discovered there, in that moment of tension and despair, wasn't just about the theater and its stories, No, that was just the tip of the iceberg. What the theater held in its depths, what it was trying to reveal to me, is something that goes beyond a simple supernatural mystery. It's a hidden truth, something that defies the rules of reality and perception. And as with every great enigma, the answer may be even more frightening than the question itself. Comment. That makes sense to me. What do you think the theater was trying to show me? Is there something more, something deeper, waiting for all of us? Have you ever felt like the reality around you suddenly no longer makes sense? I was walking down Broadway in the middle of the night when suddenly the sky closed in. There was no sign of an approaching storm, no warning, nothing. The city, as always, was vibrant, with lights twinkling and the streets bustling with life. But then something strange happened. A gust of sharp wind blew past me, and soon the sounds of the city began to fade. The usual New York hubbub, the constant sound of cars, people, and even the music from the shops simply disappeared. It was as if the city was being enveloped by a blanket of silence no one had anticipated. Before I could comprehend what was happening, a strange sensation washed over me, and then the lights began to flicker. At first, like a common electrical failure, but soon they all went out. What should have been an ordinary evening, walking the illuminated streets of one of the world's most famous cities, turned into something frightening. Broadway, with its unmistakable glow, was now shrouded in darkness. It was as if the city itself had shut down, as if it were being swallowed by something greater, something inexplicable. What made me even more disconcerted was the fact that when the lights finally came back on, the city no longer looked the same. I continued walking the streets, but the feeling that something was out of place wouldn't leave me. I could no longer recognize the details around me. The streets were empty. The sound of rain replaced the city's usual chaos, and the atmosphere was eerily quiet. I'd been to Broadway many times before, but I'd never felt anything like this. The sensation was that somehow reality had shifted around me, as if space itself had been distorted in a way I couldn't understand. Have you ever been there? Have you ever been in a familiar place and suddenly everything around you seemed different, as if reality had been rewritten from one moment to the next? Stay with me until the end, because what I experienced that night will make you question what's really happening on the streets of Broadway. Something was happening there, and I didn't yet know what it was, but as the night dragged on, I realized something much bigger was about to be revealed. What you'll discover now may surprise you. The rain, which had previously been just the distant sound of any summer, now fell heavily, as if in tune with the chaos beginning to take over the city. The sound of drops hitting the sidewalks echoed through the deserted streets in a strange, heavier way, almost as if the water were being absorbed by the walls, by the shadows, as if the street itself were swallowing itself. The sound of rain, which had previously been a common backdrop in New York, now mingled with distant echoes, voices that came from no one. They weren't shouts, they weren't footsteps, they were just sounds, as if something were moving in the shadows, watching, waiting. I walked, my feet treading water, pooling on the sidewalks, trying to ignore the growing sense of unease that was taking hold of me. The streets, normally thronged with tourists and hurried locals, were completely empty. It was as if somehow Broadway, that global icon, always full of life and light, had been swallowed by a dark, unsettling silence, the kind of silence that, in a city like this, is nearly impossible to find. A silence that made me question what was happening around me, as if all of this were temporary, a gap between what I knew and what had yet to be revealed. I kept walking, my steps heavier now. The cold began to set in, but it wasn't the normal night chill you feel on your skin. It was an internal chill, a shiver that ran up my spine, as if something were building inside me. And the further I walked, the more this sense of presence grew. It was as if I were being watched, but not by anyone physically present. There was no one on the streets, not a soul in sight. But still, The feeling of being watched, of something or someone hiding in the shadows and watching me, began to intensify, and I didn't know what it was. Why did I feel this way? What was happening? The city, by now, seemed to be transforming. The sounds of the rain, now more intense, seemed to drown out the noises that had always been present. The cars, the people talking, the music coming from the stores, all of it was dissipating, as if Broadway were being swallowed by an endless darkness that spread across the streets and buildings. It no longer felt like the place I knew, not even remotely. It was as if the scenery around me had changed, but subtly. It wasn't a change you could immediately see, but it was something you knew deep down was there, right before your eyes. I kept walking, trying to shake the thought that something was wrong, but I couldn't. The cold grew, and the feeling that I was being watched intensified, as if the very environment had come to life. The shadows on the buildings, now stronger, seemed to stretch, taking on shapes that shouldn't be there, lurking around every corner, every street. It was impossible not to notice. Something was moving around me, but I couldn't see what it was. What could be so invisible and yet so palpable? I took a deep breath, trying to ignore it, trying to convince myself it was just my mind playing tricks. But all the while, the streets remained empty, emptier, with every step I took. The sound of the rain seemed to swallow me. Gone were the echoes of voices, the sound of passing cars, the energy of New York. Everything was gone, and I was alone, lost in a place that, until then, had felt like the heart of the city. Broadway was deserted, but not in a typical way. It wasn't a temporary desert caused by a rainy night. No, something much stranger was happening, and worst of all, I knew I couldn't go back. It was as if I were trapped in this space of time, this limbo, where the place and the atmosphere were silently and relentlessly changing. But who or what was controlling this? Who or what was behind those shadows, behind the silence, watching me somehow, unseen? I didn't know. But something told me that somehow the theater was just beginning to show me what it wanted me to see. And just when I thought it was all getting too strange, I looked around and realized that what had been there before, the shops, the storefronts, the buildings, was beginning to disappear. Not physically, of course, but the feeling that the reality around me was changing was undeniable. I was no longer in Times Square, the place I knew. The streets were transforming, shaping themselves in ways that made no sense. What was happening there? Why did everything look different? Now I want to delve even deeper into this topic, because what I felt that night wasn't just a passing sensation. The city was changing before my eyes, and I knew it wasn't just the weather or the climate. Something much bigger was at play, something beyond my ability to see or understand. It was as if I were being drawn into a game, into a plan far greater than I could imagine. Something was happening there, and I was being drawn into the center of it. What I didn't yet know was that this mystery, this void expanding throughout the city, had a reason, and whatever was behind it, whatever was watching me from the shadows, had a story no one could tell until now. It was then that I realized. The shadows cast between the buildings, those same shadows that had previously seemed harmless, were moving. At first, I thought it was just the reflection of rain on the walls and windows, a common occurrence when water spreads across the city and plays with the light. But as the seconds passed, reality began to distort. The shadows were no longer simply stretching or dancing in the wind. They were moving wrongly. Something was happening there. And as the dim light from the streetlights flickered, the shadows seemed to take on a life of their own, distorted by the moonlight and the rainwater hitting the sidewalks. It wasn't just the reflection of the city, but something more, something that was beginning to form in a way I couldn't comprehend. I stood motionless, the feeling that something was about to happen engulfing me. I didn't know what to do, how to react, or how to process what I was seeing. It was as if the shadows were closing in on me, as if they were forming in a strange and intentional way. I no longer felt the presence of the crowded streets, the sound of conversations, or the hurried footsteps around me. All I heard now was the patter of the rain and the strange movement of shadows. The city seemed to have disappeared, and in its place was an unsettling presence that was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. The shadowy figures began to move more concretely, as if taking shape before me. They were no longer just dark spots on the ground. They were shapes, contours, movements that seemed to have a mind of their own. They formed and distorted, making me question whether it was all just a figment of my imagination or if something was really happening there. I looked at the buildings, at the shadows on the facades, and they seemed to surround me, as if trying to draw me into that void. There was no more space, no more escape. I felt like I was being swallowed by them, and a sense of dread washed over me. What I saw made no sense. The streets were empty, but I felt like I was being watched by something beyond my comprehension. I took a step back, trying to shake off the feeling of being surrounded, but with every movement, the shadows moved too, almost as if they were reacting to my fear, as if they sensed my attempt to escape, and that terrified me even more. It wasn't just the movement of the shadows, it was the feeling that they were becoming part of me, that somehow I was losing myself in them, letting myself be absorbed by the darkness that was taking over the city. It was as if I were living in a nightmare where the laws of physics and logic no longer applied, and reality was folding around me in an incomprehensible way. Every step I took seemed to take me further away from reality. I felt trapped, unsure of where to go, unsure of what to do. The shadows were no longer just on the walls or sidewalks. They were all around me, enveloping, as if they wanted to swallow me. The feeling of being watched, of being followed, intensified. I knew I wasn't alone. Something was there with me, something feeding on my fear, something feeding on my inability to understand what was happening. I didn't know if it was all a reflection of my mind, a hallucination caused by fear, or if the city itself was transforming into something I couldn't explain. With each new step I took, the surroundings seemed to grow denser, darker. The shadows began to move faster, forming into figures that could not be ignored. They were no longer just reflections of light and rain, but something much more real, something taking shape before me, as if emerging from an unknown place, from a parallel world where the laws of time and space no longer existed. The city, the place I had found so familiar, was now transforming into something completely different, into a space where the line between the real and the supernatural was blurring. I no longer knew what was real and what wasn't. Every shadow, every movement, every step made me question my own perception of reality. I was being consumed by them, and a sense of panic gripped me. I needed to get out, needed to find a way to escape this nightmare unfolding around me. But the more I tried to escape, the more the shadows surrounded me, the more the city became a labyrinth with no exit, where every street seemed to lead me back to the same place, because what began as shadows and an empty city became something much bigger than I could have imagined. The streets of Broadway were changing, and the shadows, now more concrete, were pulling me into a place I didn't know. Something was happening there, and I knew that somehow the city was being transformed before my eyes. But what exactly was behind this transformation? And what did the shadows want from me? I was about to find out, and at the same time, the feeling that something much more dangerous was lurking became even more real. I tried to leave. I wanted to return to a more familiar place, to a piece of reality I knew, where the streets lined up logically, where the movement of people and the constant sounds of the city reassured me that everything was somehow under control. I was being swallowed by something I didn't understand, and the only thing I wanted was to escape that feeling of persecution that followed me at every step. But something was wrong, something that couldn't be explained, and the more I tried to leave, the more the city closed in on me. Every time I tried to turn the next corner, the street transformed. It wasn't a simple misperception. I wasn't getting lost, not disoriented by the rain or the dark night. I saw clearly how the street in front of me reconfigured itself before my eyes. The facades of the buildings shifted, distorted in ways that were almost impossible to believe. Where once I'd seen a bookstore, there was now a small antique shop I'd never seen before. Where once there had been a restaurant, there was now only a concrete wall with a rusty gate. It was as if the city itself was reorganizing, reconfiguring itself, as if it had a will of its own. I was trapped inside a nightmare, in an urban labyrinth where the streets no longer followed a pattern, where space and time seemed to be folding in on themselves. I found myself facing a new facade, a new set of buildings I didn't recognize, as if the city at its core was distorting itself to trap me within. I tried to turn left onto what seemed like a familiar street, but when I looked, it was gone. Instead, there was a brick wall, an old building I knew I'd never seen before. The feeling of being lost became increasingly real. No matter how hard I tried to orient myself, the city wouldn't let me leave. It was as if I were being pushed back to the center of a place where nothing made sense anymore. And then, the true feeling of panic began to set in. I was lost. There was no way out. Broadway, which I knew so well, which I had walked countless times on nights like that, was now a maze of streets and buildings that made no sense. The city was no longer the same, and the worst part was that somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew it wasn't just a trick of my perception. Something was happening there, something beyond my comprehension. Space and time had folded in on themselves, and I was trapped in a place where nothing was as it seemed. Every corner I turned, every move I made, seemed to take me back to the same place, to the center of a distorted reality that held me prisoner. It was as if I were being manipulated by invisible forces, as if the city had become a living place, a being that controlled me, that played with me. I was no longer in control, no longer in the place I knew. Everything around me was changing, and I couldn't understand why. What was happening to the streets, to the buildings? What was happening to me? Each new scene I encountered seemed more threatening, more oppressive. The streets closed in, and fear began to become a constant presence, a feeling that something greater was preparing to show me. The city's hidden truth. I knew it was no longer a matter of simple disorientation. I knew the city was testing me, challenging me to understand what was happening, to find a way out, to escape this labyrinth. But with each attempt, with each movement, I found myself more trapped, more enveloped by the distorted reality that was taking over everything around me. The feeling that space was closing in on me was inescapable. And the most disturbing thing was that the more I tried to find a way out, the more the city seemed to pull me into the center of its plot, to a place where everything was out of place, where logic and reason no longer held sway. Because what was happening that night wasn't just a matter of streets transforming or a simple blackout. No, what was happening there was much bigger, something that couldn't be explained by the normal laws of physics and logic. Something was distorting reality around me, and I knew this was no simple accident. The city was guiding me to a place where the hidden truth of Broadway and perhaps New York would finally be revealed. Something much darker lurked, something I wasn't yet ready to understand, but which somehow had already begun to consume me. The labyrinth of the city wasn't just a physical place, it was a reflection of what was happening inside me, and I knew the impact of this would be far greater than I could ever imagine. I could feel it. What had previously been just a vague sensation now became an absolute certainty. I was being followed. And somehow I knew it wasn't just a feeling. It wasn't fear playing tricks on my mind. It wasn't fatigue confusing me with the contours of the streets. No, there was something else. Something much more sinister behind the feeling that I was being watched at every step. Something or someone was watching me, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself. The city, which until recently had seemed alive and vibrant, was now completely distorted. Every corner I turned, every new movement I made, seemed premeditated by an invisible force that knew what I would do next. I was no longer in control. I had the feeling that something or someone was orchestrating everything around me. But most unsettling of all was the fact that I couldn't pinpoint what exactly was stalking me. There were no more people, no more sounds of cars. All I was left with were distant echoes and the sound of my breath, labored, pressed by growing fear. And worst of all, the sensation that the streets were molding, changing, adapting to my journey. It was as if I were trapped in an invisible trap, constructed by something that understood my movements even before I made them. As I looked at the buildings around me, the shadows that had previously seemed merely part of the urban landscape now seemed more intense, more tangible. They were no longer merely distorted by the streetlights. They moved, rearranged, as if taking on a life of their own. I didn't know if it was all part of some collective illusion, or if, in fact, what I was experiencing was a unique perception, a manifestation of the supernatural unfolding before my eyes. But what I felt with every step I took was that the space around me was being transformed, reorganized by something I couldn't see, but which was very close, lurking, waiting. It was as if time had stopped, or rather, as if time were being manipulated to trap me there. Each street I turned seemed to merge into the next, creating a tangle of streets and buildings that no longer made sense. I was trapped in a maze. There was no clear path, no direction. All I knew was that something was watching me, something hiding in the shadows of the streets, in the darkness of the building facades. Now, when I close my eyes and try to remember that night, the feeling of persecution doesn't disappear. On the contrary, it becomes clearer, more vivid. I find myself wondering, am I still being followed? Is that something that watched me? Waiting, still there, waiting for the right moment to reveal itself again. Every time I pass through Times Square, the city seems to call to me, as if that place was still alive, waiting for me to discover something more, something that is still hidden in plain sight, but that no one can perceive. I find myself wondering more and more about what really happened that night. Was it just a nightmare? Or could it be that somehow New York City, with its unique energy, its immensity, and its mystery, hides something much greater, something that reveals itself only when you're willing to look beyond what meets the eye? And could it be that somehow the place keeps changing around me, shaping itself with every step, every movement? What's happening there on the streets of Broadway that we can't understand? What I began to realize that night wasn't just a blackout or empty streets. What was happening in New York was something much deeper, much more unfathomable. The city was being transformed, not in a physical way, but in a way that affected our perception of reality. What lay behind these changes? What was hidden in the shadows of Times Square? I didn't know the answer, but I knew I wasn't alone on this journey, and that in itself was enough to make me want to discover the truth. If you've made it this far, it's because somehow you know something strange is happening in the world around us, something beyond what we can see at first glance. And I'm glad you've decided to embark on this journey with me. After all, these mysteries we're unraveling together have something more, something that connects us in a unique way, doesn't it? If you were touched by this story, if anything here resonated with you, leave a comment saying, "This message was for me." I love reading your thoughts and knowing that in some way I'm connecting the pieces with what's happening on the other side of the screen. Oh, and if you enjoyed the content, please leave a like. This helps us continue exploring these mysteries, bringing you more stories that may surprise you even more. And of course, if you want to understand more about what happens in the shadows of our reality, just continue on to the next video. It's a continuation of this journey that will surely captivate you. See you around.